Hello, Jeff.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well, and you?
I'm doing well as well. I'm doing,
Good. It looks like we might be the only two.
I don't think that's going to be true, but hopefully not. I had a lot of requests for your talk actually. So I was just checking online to see if there were any other people requesting the access. And
All
Kelvin
right.
emailed a couple, or like an hour ago and asked me for the confirmation. So he should be here.
All right.
Is it raining up in at Holy Cross?
Yes, it is where I'm at.
Yeah,
And uh, the temperatures is warm, right? It's pleasant enough,
right.
but it's wet. And because I'm doing this, I'm actually spared from doing the afternoon walk of the dog.
Okay.
I've done my part this morning, and it wasn't bad. It wasn't even drizzling when I got her out.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but right now it's yeah, a moderate rain.
Yeah.
Uh, is it the same where you are?
Yeah, it's a pretty good rain right now. It's too wet for the dogs. They're just sitting here right now. So you might hear them bark at some point if a squirrel runs by.
Yes, yes. My husband has been training the little one who is pushing 7 months to be hunting squirrels. So
Okay.
my job is actually to train her to refrain from going after the squirrels. So we'll see what the result is, depending on who she goes, with whom she goes for her walk. She gets
Right.
a very different exercise.
Yeah. What kind of, do you just have one dog?
Yes, we have a Shiba Inu, and prior to this, also a Shiba Inu. And I guess we kind of like them because they are very independent
Okay.
and very difficult to train, actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, because of their independence.
Right.
They kind of expect uh, to be given a reason when you want them to do something. uh, yeah, but fortunately with this one, she's a puppy and very amenable to training. So who knows?
Okay.
Yeah.
We have a 3-year-old and a like 13-month-old. So the 13-month-old is still puppyish and hopefully can be trained a little bit better than the 3-year-old. But they're both rescues, so who knows what they were like before, we got
Right.
them.
Yes, Himari is a rescue too, and prior to her, we also have another Shiba who was a rescue from Okinawa.
Oh,
So
really?
she came to us when she was already 3, and so she was, yeah, totally untrainable in the sense that you you just have to lower your expectations. So if you were to ask her to come, you'll add only if you want to.
Okay.
Only if you want to come.
Nice.
So it's that level. But she lived to be 16, and during the last 11 months of her life after a stroke, we actually found out that she had chronic kidney disease. So we were doing the daily subcutaneous injections.
Okay.
Yeah, and that sustained her for 11 months, and then after her second stroke, that was it.
Right.
And yeah, but she lived to be 16, and that was pretty good.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
good for a dog.
yeah, right.
No.
Uh,
We'll just
so
give it a couple more minutes, everyone, just to see how many other people we can have show up. It's a Saturday, so they might be running late. Yeah, these are the first dogs we've had, so I'm, waiting for the 8-year mark when, or whatever it is. I know the smaller they are, the longer they live. So
that's right. That's
yeah,
right.
so I don't expect them to make it to 16 years, but we'll see how far they do make it.
Yes, and who knows? I mean, the previous Shiba we had, she was only about 15 pounds, but she's a small dog, but not one of those tiny dogs. So it's comparable to a Sheltie or something like that.
Mhm.
But it's all fluff, all hair, but not. And with Himari also, she'll probably be about 17 pounds when full grown.
Okay.
They're not very big, so I think that helps with the
Yeah.
longevity. You kind of hope.
Some hope there, yes.
Oh, yes, yes.
Uh,
And what we feed her. So we intend on not giving her any people food.
oh,
Uh,
really? Okay.
yes. Well, she's on a kind of fish, egg, and homemade diet with kibbles for training her, and canned, wet dog food. And so we'll see. The other one, it worked for the other one.
Okay.
For a long time, and homemade yogurt.
Oh,
That's
nice.
the important thing.
Yeah, my brother was trying to convince me to do the make the food for the dogs, and I was just like, let me see how the kibble works, and we'll see after that. So they're doing okay on the kibble. I might venture out someday to make the, like, I think he uses fish and
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah. So whatever, in essence, it's people food, but
right.
cooked as blandly as possible. But who knows what goes into the kibbles.
Right.
But at least they're dry when it comes to training them and walking around in a pouch.
Yeah.
I'm sure that the audience is just thrilled. This ongoing talk about our dogs.
Yeah, probably a little thrilled.
Yeah.
So welcome everyone to this wonderful Saturday. It's raining here, and I think it's raining where May is. So we're happy to be inside a warm place. I hope you are as well. Peter, did you have any announcements that you wanted to make for ISME or anything?
Just to remind everyone that the annual general meeting will be taking place next week at more or less this time. So you're all very welcome. It won't be very dramatic, but there'll be a chance to sort of hear about what we have planned for the coming year, including hopefully confirmation of the annual conference, which is going to be happening at the University of Navarre in Pamplona, Spain.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So for those of you who are first time here, this is a meeting of the Center for Contemporary Aristotelian Studies in Ethics and Politics, which I'm happy to be directing now that it's moved to the US. And we have a close relationship with the International Society for Mercantile Inquiry. So there's often cross collaboration between us, and they advertise our information as we advertise theirs. We have two CASEP, we have two research fellows that provide talks each semester. The last talk we had was by Professor Kelvin Knight, and our talk today is by Professor May Sim, who is at Holy Cross College. And her talk, I want to get the title correct because it's a little longer than I could remember. So give me just a second. Rethinking Perfectionism and Human Rights for Aristotle and the Early Confucians. Last year, you also talked about Confucius and Aristotle, but not on rights, if I remember. Is that correct?
Yes, it was on transgenerational justice.
Transgenerational. So this is a continuing discussion in the broader field of justice, but focusing on rights. So everyone,
Yes.
let's welcome Professor Sim, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you very much. I'm going to try to share my screen as I have a PowerPoint, and perhaps you can tell me if it is advancing when I advance it. Did it advance?
It did not at this point. We just see we don't see the actual presentation. We just see the slides as you edit them.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is that this happens from time to time, and I'm going to, did I stop share?
You did.
Okay, now I'm going to try it again, and maybe it'll work this time.
There we go.
So, all right, do you see the title page?
We do.
And is it advancing to the next page?
It is.
Perfectionism? Okay.
Thank you.
So it needed the reset. If anything happens in between, please just, give me a shout out. I don't read my chats when I'm presenting. So as you can see, the title of my talk has changed to Rethinking Perfectionism and Human Rights for Aristotle and Confucius. I just don't have the space to deal with all of the early Confucians. So this is a more modest project. And so perfectionism is a challenge to human rights considerations here when it comes to perfectionism and the virtues for Aristotle and Confucius, because it's frequently regarded as being incompatible with human rights, in that perfectionism limits the values and interests that rights protect. So prioritizing a view of the flourishing life, such as Aristotle and Confucius do, is antithetical to a liberal approach of putting an individual's right to choose over the good. So when considering the relevance of Confucius for modernity, to make him relevant to the modern world, commentators argue that Confucius's ethics have the resources to support individual autonomy, liberalism, and pluralism of ideas. Their claims ultimately concern perfectionism and choices in Confucian thought, and how much perfectionism one could continue expecting from a Confucian view that is relevant for the modern world. Now, questions then about choices are as follows. What sorts of choices does an autonomous individual have in the modern world? And are these choices open to a Confucian? There's no explicit theory of choice in Confucius, but given the affinities between Confucius's and Aristotle's ethics, I appeal to Aristotle's robust theory of choice to illuminate how choice would function for Confucius. And there'll be implications for virtue ethics. So apart from showing how choice works for Confucius, given Aristotle's and Confucius's shared endorsement of virtue ethics, getting clear about choice for them offers relevant resources about autonomy and liberalism for virtue ethics too. We can then ascertain ultimately how liberal or conservative virtue ethics can be. In this talk, I discussed two different approaches to the defense of individual autonomy or liberalism in Confucius. My choice of authors lies in their understanding of autonomy being the same as what modern Western societies mean by it. So in this article, Confucianism and Liberalism, Du Weiming argues for a Confucianism that is open-minded rather than a closed-off system. He acknowledges that modernity is inseparable from the, quote, two central ideals of liberalism, freedom and human rights. These are central to the modern market economy and democracy. Freedom for two, quote, underlines such ideas as individual autonomy, choice, dignity, and rights that have served as the foundation of contemporary Western societies, end quote. Confucianism then cannot but modernize for Tu. Tu holds that Confucianism is not only compatible with liberalism, but its ideal of personhood is more suited to democracy than either traditional feudalism or modern authoritarianism. Tu asserts only, quote, after being baptized in the values brought out by the Enlightenment, end quote, can Confucianism offer us the resources to criticize the Enlightenment mentality and solve our modern problems. Preaching Confucianism has the resources for addressing human rights in our contemporary world, according to Tu. One of Singapore government's 5 principles for a well-functioning society, according to Tu, is, quote, the community and the state are higher than the individual, end quote. And Tu disagrees with this claim. Rather, it is the ruler's responsibility to protect people's rights and look out for their welfare. He maintains, quote, people have the right to demand from rulers their fundamental security, basic needs for living, and the conditions for self-development, end quote. Moreover, quote, Confucianism always set more strict demands on the rulers. Because they have greater power and higher position, they are enjoined to be strict with themselves and more generous with others. End quote. Now, I have 2 responses to Tu. First, Tu's claim that the Confucian ruler is responsible for the welfare of the people can be seen as an instance of prioritizing the community or the state over the individual. That is, the ruler is the individual, whereas the people are the community or the state. So his argument against the priority of the community over the individual by discussing the ruler's obligation supports the very principle he denies. Now, Confucius actually prioritizes the community over the individual. When questioned about Dren, that is the highest virtue of humaneness or benevolence, Confucius answers that he is one who loves others and knows others. Moreover, he is devoted to what is appropriate or righteous for the people. He considers if he has done his best, Zhong, for the people in his daily self-examination. So all of these are quotations from Confucius's Analects that shows that someone who has the highest Confucian virtue is always acting for the sake of the community. So contrary to their support for the Singapore government's principle, which actually are consistent and compatible with Confucius's Analects. Now, my second response to Tu is that it isn't clear that his claim about the Confucian ruler's responsibility to the people is bound up with the kind of liberalism and autonomy that characterizes modernity. For Tu, liberalism is a position where, quote, no presuppositions, no beliefs, and no dogmas are exempt from being fully discussed and questioned, end quote. My question is, can Confucianism endorse such openness and still maintain the kind of strict demands on the ruler's exercise of his rights? Specifically, is the demand that Confucian rulers be strict with themselves and generous with others, or the demand of acting according to reciprocity, that is not doing to someone what you don't want them to do to you, consistent with the liberal perspective where every value is subject to questioning? If not, is the Confucian individual as autonomous as the individual of modernity. Now, Heine Ritz criticizes Tu's way of substituting a Confucian modernity for Western modernity. Far from escaping the Enlightenment mentality engendered ailment of individual acquisitiveness and instrumental rationality in Western modernity, Ritz observes that these same sickness plague the Chinese today. So my conclusion to discussing Tu's approach is that contrary to his assertion that Confucianism shares the liberalism, the pluralism of ideas about the good life, Confucianism would only undermine its own moral values and the means of cultivating them if such pluralism were embraced. Now, moving on to my second choice of author, Joseph Chan, in his book, Confucian Perfectionism, states, quote, Confucianism as a comprehensive doctrine constitutes a form of ideological politics that must be rejected if we regard civility as an important virtue. In an open society, the promulgation of comprehensive doctrines is not only allowed by law, but also actively supported by civil society. Inevitably, conflict and struggle will arise from the free exchange of views and free pursuit of interests, end quote. Continuing, he says, to maintain civic concord, citizens must exercise self-constraint, and no group should attempt to impose its own worldview and system of values on others in a winner-take-all fashion. So what Chan does is to propose a sort of moderate perfectionism. So the Confucianism's political philosophy for him then, quote, should not be derived from a comprehensive doctrine of the good. So his view then is that Confucianism needs to be modified in its view of perfectionism and to dumb it down to a kind of moderate perfectionism. Now, let's look at his account of this moderate Confucianism in his article, Moral Autonomy, Civil Liberties, and Confucianism. He proposes a sense of, quote, personal autonomy to accommodate civil liberties in an environment that is radically different from traditional Confucianism. This autonomy for Chan is distinct from the liberal theorist's understanding. Now let's examine his details. Chan starts with 4 elements that characterize our common understanding of moral autonomy. And these are first, the voluntary endorsement of morality. Second, a reflective engagement in moral life. Third, morality as self-legislation. And fourth, morality as the radical free expression of the individual's will. Now for Chan, 1 and 2 contribute to a minimal conception of moral autonomy, which support a limited degree of civil liberties. 3 and 4 are stronger and offer strong support of civil liberties. Now, the first 2, that is voluntary endorsement and reflective engagement, according to Chan, can be found in Confucianism, but not the last 2, namely self-legislation and liberal individualist perspective. Now, I'm going to focus on Chan's 4th element. The liberal individualist perspective, which stresses individuality, where people are authors of their own lives. Quote, from the liberal individualist perspective, what we respect is not merely the common features that define a human being, but more importantly, the uniqueness of each human individual. A distinct personal identity and path of life history, a unique blend of dispositions, tastes, and talents, a personal ambition in life and perspective on the world, end quote. So for Chan, personal autonomy is an important value in our contemporary world. Like Tu's concern to modernize Confucianism, Chan thinks that Confucianism should incorporate a moderate version of personal autonomy to make it more attractive and adaptable to the conditions of modern society. Chan says, quote, a contemporary version of Confucian political theory could welcome a moderate version of personal autonomy, treating it as one value that competes with and at times can be outweighed by such other values as well-being and ethical ideals. This will enable Confucianism a much stronger justification for civil liberties, since personal choices which are wrong can nevertheless be admitted. Specifically, one is not merely free to pursue morally right actions, according to Chan, but also content-independent acts, that is, acts that are independent of their goodness, justified simply because they are the agent's personal choices. Insofar as Chan still permits moral and paternalistic considerations in the exercise of freedom, he claims that his personal autonomy is moderate and hence distinct from a liberal theorist's version of liberty. Now, using Chan's personal autonomy, he sees it as offering an internal revision to the traditional understanding of filial piety, or xiao, which emphasized obedience to one's parents. In the context of new social circumstances in modern societies, heretofore unexperienced by parents in the past, Chan claims that filial piety nowadays should not include obedience. So more elaborately, given the advances in technology, mobility, and communication, as well as increased choices of education and occupation, not to mention marriage partners, parents today, according to Chan, lack the experience to make such choices for their children. Children should have the autonomy to make their own choices. Obedience in xiao, or filial piety, then, is incompatible with personal autonomy. Filial piety, then, xiao, should just include respect and honor by listening to parents' advice and supporting them in their old age. Here's my first response to Chan. His addition of personal autonomy to modernize Confucianism is indeed liberal. More controversial than abdicating obedience is Chan's suggestion that Confucianism ought to allow wrong actions or choices because they enable individuals to be authors of their own lives. Would this be consistent with Confucianism? Let's examine Confucius's attitude toward human errors. Even though Confucius admits that people make mistakes, he emphasizes their correcting these mistakes and striving for humaneness, which in turn enables them to avoid wrong actions. Quote, when exemplary persons dream to go astray, it is like an eclipse of the sun and moon. When they stray, everyone sees it. And when they correct their course, everyone looks up to them. Mistakes then are to be avoided for Confucius. Exemplary persons seldom make mistakes, just as eclipses of the sun and moon are rare occurrences. Correcting their mistakes, however, is truly admirable. Consider Confucius's claims that a real mistake occurs when one fails to correct it, and how the humane person is one who can avoid what is wrong. These precepts are contrary to Chan's moderate personal autonomy modification, which focuses on individual choice, even if it is independent of being moral. Here's my second response to Chan. He asserts that his brand of personal autonomy is moderate, since the traditional paternalistic and moral values are still being considered despite their contradiction to individualistic values. But when is it appropriate for individualistic values, independent of goodness or rightness, to supersede moral values? By what criteria would such supersession be ascertained? Chan offers no answers. Now, Confucius offers his own resources for obedience. Instead of abdicating obedience, I suggest that Confucius' virtue of appropriateness, or righteousness, enables us to ascertain the correct action. Quote, exemplary persons, Junzi, in making their way in the world, are neither bent on nor against anything. Rather, they go with what is appropriate, or righteous. Is a virtue that is most relevant at times when one can either profit oneself or do the right thing which benefits another in situations of honor, safety, or wealth. As he puts it, quote, if on seeing a chance to profit, they think of appropriate conduct. On seeing danger, they are ready to give their lives. And when long in desperate straits, they still do not forget the words they live by. Such persons can also be said to be consummate, that is, complete in their virtues. So adding the virtue of ren, or humaneness, to appropriateness or righteousness, a Confucian is able to figure out when to disobey or obey one's parents. Namely, the measure is whether one is acting humanely or with the highest moral virtue. There's no need to rule out obedience completely. There'll be times when one obeys and others not if obeying violates humaneness. Quote, in serving your father and mother, remonstrate with them gently. On seeing that they do not heed your suggestions, remain respectful and do not act contrary. Although concerned, voice no resentment. So it is all right to disagree with one's parents. What's crucial is how one does it and for what reason. That ren, or humaneness, is foremost. See 1536, where Confucius encourages non-compliance with the teacher when pursuing humaneness. Abdicating obedience in order to exercise one's personal choice, especially for an immoral action, is incompatible with Confucianism. Making a wrong decision just to be the author of his own life is also not a good reason for disobeying one's parents. So Chan proposes his moderate personal autonomy to provide a stronger justification for civil liberties in Confucianism. However, without clear criteria for when personal autonomy should trump moral values, it is questionable if Chan's justification for civil liberties is stronger or just arbitrary. Let's move on to choice. Thus far, I've shown how Tu's and Chan's attempts to transform Confucianism for modernity by introducing individual autonomy are incompatible with Confucianism. I now draw on Aristotle's view of choice to illustrate why the kind of liberalism Tu and Chan propose won't work for perfectionist accounts such as Aristotle's and Confucius's, and hence can't be endorsed by them. Now, choice for Aristotle is bound up with our characters. Good choices make us virtuous and vice versa. Choices are about the things we can do rather than things that are by nature from necessity, that are eternal or not up to us. For example, scientific and mathematical objects are not what we deliberate about and choose, nor do we choose things that are by chance, already in the past, or affairs of other nations. So most importantly, Aristotle holds that choice is not about ends, but rather about the means that promote the ends. For example, doctors don't choose if they will heal, but rather how they will heal. So not choosing the end of an expertise applies universally to all practices for Aristotle. Accordingly, not everything is a matter of choice for Aristotle. That the human good is to lead a flourishing life is not a matter of choice. Rather, making fine choices about how one should act so that one can reach one's end of a flourishing life is proper to choice. Even though the kind of rationality involved in choice is instrumental, for we are always deliberating about the means to an end, such reasoning does not proceed indefinitely, or it will result in a frustration of all our desires. Choice, then, is always guided by the highest end or perfection, which enables us to rank order the intermediate goods or ends so that we know which actions are prior to others. Aristotle and Confucius share the belief that there is a highest good for human beings. This is the life of virtue for each, achieving the intellectual virtues of practical wisdom for Nisus and Sophia for Aristotle, and humaneness for Confucius. Even though one may choose various actions to achieve the virtues, for example, courageous, generous, or just actions, depending on one's circumstances, the highest good is not open to choice. No choice of the highest good doesn't mean that we can do away with choice, as something Confucian commentators, such as the two above, suggest, saying that our roles and relations are sufficient, such as others recommend. Choice is required insofar as Confucius espouses virtuous acts, like acting with reciprocity, and appropriateness or righteousness, for there must be a self with a history who can judge what is reciprocal and righteous for his role and circumstances. Because no general rule can prescribe the correct action for every situation to enable one to reach the final end of being Dren or humane, Confucians cannot rely on their roles and relations without a self who chooses. And here I'm arguing against specific commentators who advocate a no-self view for Confucius. Now, apart from the determinateness of the final end of virtue for both authors, they also agree that non-virtuous acts, for example, intemperate, greedy, or cowardly acts, are always base. Accordingly, their perfectionism forbids the kind of liberalism which entertain all presuppositions, beliefs, and dogmas, and the content independent acts from any autonomous individual, according to Chan. Now, instrumental rationality by itself offers no guidance for rank ordering one pursuit over another. What's required is a standard that informs us about our highest perfection, which in turn enables the rank ordering and choice of competing intermediate goals. For Aristotle and Confucius, the highest perfection is the life of virtue. Not only is the highest and some kind of virtue of virtues, but the means to this end are virtues too. On one hand, virtues limit our choices. On the other, they offer guidance for a unified life, both individually and collectively. Aristotle and Confucius differ in their accounts for why each of their conceptions of virtue is correct, but their virtue ethics share in being incompatible with an endorsement of liberalism and pluralism regarding conceptions of the good life. Some conceptions of the good life would be rejected because they're neither good for the individual nor for his community, because they prohibit the development of virtue. Far from being paternalistic or intolerant, identifying and rejecting these alternatives are the strengths of Confucianism and Aristotle. The concern with rights no doubt played a part in fueling Tu's and Chan's interest in creating a more liberal Confucianism. It is not the freedom to choose per se, based on the uneducated pursuit of short-term pleasures, that can offer the standards for why human beings ought to have certain rights. Rather, rights are always moral and are justified by ultimate goods, which make us virtuous and enable our flourishing. In conclusion, identifying the correct ultimate good or perfection and denying our choice with respect to it, yet stressing the significance of choices of means to this good, are the liberties for Confucianism. These two are the liberties that are to be protected by rights. And thank you. I'm going to stop sharing. And all right. And you're
Thank
still
you very
here.
much. Thank you very much, May. Do you want to field your own questions, or would you like me to do that?
Yes, I'm happy to recognize the questioners, given that.
Okay.
Yes.
So we're open to questions then. So I will start us off if that's okay. So when I was taught about Confucianism in, say, introductory philosophy, or when I think TA'd for a class on Asian philosophies, it was always associated with utilitarianism. And I wondered if you thought about that relationship in your discussion in terms of J.S. Mill's defenses of perfectionism and his version of liberalism, and whether that would be a more appropriate kind of model of liberalism that Confucianism could be associated with.
All right. Good. Thank you for the question. I wouldn't associate Confucianism with utilitarianism. And the reason why is because it's not just the consequences right? And the results that one ought to be aiming for, the greatest good, for the greatest number. For Confucianism, on the contrary, it's a matter of doing the right thing and being virtuous. So it's the good that is what's going to take priority. And so regardless of how many will end up being benefited in the end, it is the choice that leads to the virtuous action that would supersede. So yeah, it would be antithetical to utilitarianism.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Peter.
Hi, thank you. I have a question which is sort of aimed at the very last part of your presentation, how rights will be generated. But before I get to, I just wanted to sort of check I'm understanding the overall structure of the paper. I took it that the thinkers you introduced in the first section, you regard as straining too hard to create a Confucianism which is sort of friendly to liberalism, and in doing so, they're giving up aspects of the Confucian tradition which is sort of essential to that tradition.
Correct.
But in the second part, you were trying to say, well, while they were going too far, there are ways in which you can have rights generated authentically within Confucianism. And if I understood the last part correctly, you were saying that the rights that are properly conferred and justified on Confucian terms will give a certain liberty about the choice of means, but they will always be justified by genuine goods. That's not just things that some individual might regard as good.
Right.
And I see how that, I think I sort of see how that justification works. But it seems to me that the rights generated there will be a quite limited set when compared to the rights that sort of inhabitants of modern sort of liberal pluralist democracies are used to. And so I wanted to sort of ask about that. I mean, is that a consequence that you're sort of happy with? It does seem to me that there are lots of rights that people are sort of used to asserting that couldn't plausibly be claimed with that kind of justification.
Yes. Now, give me a few examples of the rights that you think that will be excluded.
Well, I'm trying. I mean, the two that sort of came to mind were, I mean, so although I'm English, I live in America, and here there's just a very absolutist tradition with regard to freedom of speech and expression. And it seems to me that while an argument in this mode could justify some degree of liberty there, there's probably quite a lot people are used to sort of claiming as within their rights, which just it would be hard to justify if you have a robust conception of the goods being sort of being served. And the other one was with regard to sort of liberty of sexual behaviors and things like that, where I don't know exactly where lines would be drawn, but again, it seems they probably would be the rights justified by this sort of argument wouldn't be as expansive as the ones we're accustomed to. And I don't know whether that's a problem or not. I was just in a way, because the structure seems quite clear to me, but I
Yes.
because you ended there, I wasn't quite sure sort of what you thought the actual content of rights generated in this mode would look like.
Good. Good. I appreciate your asking this question, because this then allows me to talk more specifically about the rights that will be supported by Confucianism. And here I would want to say that Confucianism would support the rights to free speech, as well as here, sexual preferences. All right, this is how it's going to look like. In Confucianism, at least in the Analects, and of course, this is actually going to be shared by other Confucians as well. What governs speech is truthfulness, and how by speaking the truth, one is cultivating the virtue of being trustworthy. One of the virtues, one of the Confucian virtues is to be a trustworthy person, and hence practicing truthfulness in one's speech is key. Now, so think about freedom of speech. I know that in the US, freedom of speech includes the freedom to just say whatever we want. But nevertheless, even this sort of freedom is limited in certain contexts. So for instance, if you are in a crowded theater, you do not yell fire, right? Nor, oh, there's an active shooter in our days. That seems to be more common because that would just lead to chaos. And so the kind of rights that are promoted then are the rights to, yes, the freedom of speech, so that you could, while practicing that speech, of course, narrowed by the moral right of speaking truthfully, you are actually then enabled to develop your virtue of trustworthiness. So that's, free speech. And, when it comes to the free speech to criticize one's political leader. So for instance, right now is a good example of, what's happening in China, the protests over the COVID lockdowns. And once again, right, they're inching back into the protests for democracy and for President Xi Jinping to step down. That kind of speech, actually, if you think about it, is truthful. It's the folks have been in conditions that stifle their mobility and their ability to develop themselves, get together, congregate, and associate with each other to develop their virtues. And that is, right-worthy kind of protest and speech that if right, these early Confucians were alive, would say, yes, go for it. That is a right that Confucianism can support. So that's an example from today. And as for the freedom for sexual partners, that I think can be supported by Confucianism if you think about how it is that humaneness is the highest moral virtue, and that stems from our cultivation of love in the family. And so love, if you think about it, the injunction to love others, right? It doesn't say that you need to limit your love to only, right, people of a particular sexual orientation or gender and so forth. But love is, right, this virtue that you are to extend to all others. So if someone were to choose a certain sort of sexual partner to set up a familial relationship, that is something that I think, right, modernized Confucianism can endorse. Go ahead.
I was going to say, if I could just follow up quickly on that. I was a bit vague in the sort of how I imagined it might go. The kind of case I wasn't really imagining cases to do with sexual orientation or the sexes of different partners, so much as people who sort of have relations where there's no assumption that sort of love is even being sought. You know, sort of people who just they'll pull out their phone, they'll find a partner for the evening. And again, it's understood by all participants, we're not in the business of looking for love, you know, here. So
Okay.
I imagine that to be something which a lot of people have sort of got used to being, you know, some people approve, some people disapprove, but they get used to it just being within the realm of we're liberal adults deciding to do what we want with our lives.
All right.
So
Good.
I was mentioning that, but one other observation, it sounded to me like that part of the justification here has to do with a kind of pedagogy and virtue that involves giving people a scope of freedom because
Yeah.
it matters that they choose voluntarily to pursue the right path. And I that makes sense to me, but it seems a bit different from the argument as it was offered at the end of the paper, because I took it to be a choice of means from the point of view of the agent, whereas this seems to be a choice of means from the point of view of the governing body deciding on what the scope of freedom should be. And its chosen means is to give agents wide latitudes in how to behave, in the hope that they can be then encouraged to sort of choose virtuously and cultivate sort of virtue voluntarily.
Right. Now, I'm glad that you clarified the question about love. So you're talking about, yes, one night stands where folks are just freely associating with each other, yes, in a promiscuous manner. And that would not be endorsed by Confucianism. And why? It is because it encourages a kind of dismissive and, non-serious attitude when it comes to human, right, relationships that are supposed to be more meaningful, and yeah, so that would not be encouraged, even though the thing is that yeah, if they wouldn't encourage that, but would they crack down on it? The question then would lean on whether cracking down on those pursuits then would actually impact the more serious relationships they may wish to pursue or support in developing people's virtues. Now, when it comes to the choices, the ends, essentially Confucianism is going to have this view about what leads to human flourishing, a comprehensive view, the view that Chan thinks that we need to modify in order to update it, to be more friendly, to be friendlier to the liberals. And so it's an account that need not be advocated by a government. So for instance, what I'm saying in my example of what's happening in China today is that the CCP has missed the right crux and the values embodied by Confucianism. if they were to curtail the freedom of speech and gathering and protest and all of those activities, because by limiting people's opportunities to engage in those activities, they are actually limiting the people's ability to cultivate their virtues. Does that?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's helpful. I should let someone else, but that's clarified a lot for me. Thank you.
Okay, good.
May, you're talking about the CCP. I think a decade or so ago, well, I think the People's Republic is still promoting, but perhaps not so vigorously, Confucius institutes. But how surely we could see an analogy between the CCP and its rulership for the common good of the much vaster entity that is the People's Republic than Singapore, on the other hand, which was your example of a political continuation of the authentic Confucian tradition, I suppose. But given what you say about Tu's, your criticism of Tu's account of the relationship between well, other individuals and the individual, the person of the ruler, could there not be a Confucian? Could Confucius himself, who is your reference for the authentic Confucian tradition, rather as Aquinas might be for contemporary Thomists, but could we not draw an analogy between the self-justification of the CCP on the one hand and Confucius's own justification of obedience to the emperor, the imperial ruler?
Yes, I think that that's a natural analogy and comparison to make, except that despite the fact that Xi Jinping is professing and claiming Confucianism as one of the schools of philosophies that represent what his government is striving for, he's not. I mean, I'm disagreeing with his interpretation and his practice. The thing is that his treatment of the people is not reflective of the Confucian values. And the thing is that Confucianism and Confucian values have been quite, lucrative for these East Asian governments. And that's why in the early 1990s, Singapore actually flirted with the idea of, and invited Tu Weiming to show up in primetime television back in the 80s to discuss Confucianism. Think about it, primetime TV, you turn on the TV, 7:30, 8 o'clock, and Tu Weiming is instructing the whole country about Confucianism. And then, right, it kind of morphed into a kind of Asian values defense of these East Asian nations, where they think that, look, forget about the UDHR and the rights that are being promulgated in that document, which purport to be universal, but rather when it comes to Asian nations, they ought to have their own rights that fit their cultures better than these Western rights that promote individualism and that ultimately lead to the permissiveness and the decadence of Western culture. So you are right that these Asian governments frequently would rely on Confucianism to, in a self-serving manner, to defend their own agendas when it comes to how they're going to govern their countries. And what I'm saying is that, all right, there are some more liberal values in Confucianism, but ultimately, there are also limits, and these limits, the reason why I bring in Aristotle is because these limits are actually shared by other virtue-oriented traditions, so that as long as you have a vision of a flourishing life that is bound up with becoming virtuous human beings, there are going to be certain limitations to what you are encouraging people to pursue. Does that answer your question?
Oh, well, I think it does a lot more, really. So, okay, so you see the relationship between Confucianism and its virtue ethics on the one hand, and Aristotelianism and, let's say, its virtue ethics on the other. Their relationship to the UDHR, contemporary human rights, very similar, and you're aiming to argue that given this similarity of function, they each in a very analogous way give a morally superior kind of human rights.
That's right.
Right. Okay. No, thank you. Thank you.
So what I'm defending is, virtue-oriented human rights that are necessarily moral rights. So it's not just a right to pursue whatever interest that comes to mind, but rather whatever rights one could pursue according to these traditions must be moral rights that promote one's development of the virtues. So in contrast to many of these Asian nations who want, and including China, that wish to say, forget about the civil and political rights. Don't make democracy the norm of all governments, but rather let us have our economic, social, and cultural and developmental rights, because this is what we need to develop ourselves before we can then let the people have the right to vote and the other civil and political rights that come with them. And that would include cracking down on the freedom of speech, according to these defenders, because they think that, look, if you just let the people say whatever they want, they are going to undermine the authority of the government and create chaos in their societies, which, right, is what we're looking at right now in China, and that's a no-no for them.
You gonna
Right.
continue, Calvin?
I don't know if there's any. Is there anyone else who wants to ask volunteer a question?
But I wanted to have some questions, but I will yield to you for the moment.
Well, no. I'd like to yield to someone else, actually, which
Well, that is true as well.
Grossly illegitimate move, but perhaps Tom Angier, who I see is here, even though I can't presently see his. Tom, if you're listening, I believe that one of the many books that you're presently editing or co-editing for Cambridge University Press, I think the most recent one to come out, even though I think CUP is saying it's coming out in 2023, but I think last week Tom co-edited a book on natural law and human rights, and I'd be very interested to hear what Tom might think of May's project, and if Tom might see some radical analogy, similarity perhaps between what May's doing with Confucius and Aristotle, and what I believe Tom in particular is doing with Aquinas and Aristotle in his most recent publication.
Thanks, Kelvin. Yeah.
sorry to have.
Thanks for volunteering me. Well, I mean, I find myself a bit handicapped in the current discussion because I don't know the Confucian tradition, so I can't comment on that. But I mean, I'll say a word about Aristotle, which is that I think I'm right in saying that in the politics, Aristotle views it as a job of government to promulgate the virtues and to ensure through law that the virtues are promoted. So there's a sense in which modern states are vicious for Aristotle because they tend to think that virtue is not their business, that they have to just make room for people's exercise of their own conception of the moral virtues, but they don't think that there are any virtues that the state can determine and, as it were, sponsor. So I think that well, just a question to May, perhaps on that score. I found it difficult to calibrate the positive view she was advocating. It was on the one hand that she seemed to be quite robust in her denial of the compatibility between Confucianism as historically embodied and contemporary liberal democracy. On the other hand, she was seeming to be quite Irenic and compatibilist in her positive suggestions to Peter. So can I just get a bit of clarification about that? Is it that you think the historical Confucian tradition is difficult to render compatible with, say, American democracy, but there's a kind of constructed Confucianism or altered or sort of moderated Confucianism which you feel is compatible?
Thank you for the question, Tom. And yes, I'd like to take the opportunity to clarify. And what I want to say is that unlike Chan, who is offering a moderate perfectionism account of Confucianism in order to bring Confucianism up to date in terms of its palatability to contemporary societies. I want to say that the virtues and the perfection unmodified that are embodied by traditional Confucianism is sufficient for dealing with the issues in the contemporary world. And if nothing else, it actually offers us the resources for solving some of the problems that modern liberal nations are facing in their use of human rights, for instance. And the reason is because here I'm giving, I think that Confucianism and Aristotelianism can offer us the content for the good that human beings are to pursue, so that in contrast to the more liberal nations' view that the government should remain neutral when it comes to advocating any positive content for what's good. I think that there's a way of coming to an agreement about the common goods for the modern nations. Right now, if you look at climate change, that's a challenge that is common to all of us. That's not something, that only some of us are affected by, but rather it's all encompassing. And that is solving that problem is a common good. And that then, whatever rights one needs to engage in that kind of pursuit is one that, especially the Confucians and Aristotelians would support. And it's their willingness to advocate a content for the good that is helpful. And I think that the moment you start whittling away at that content, such as what Tu and Chan have done, you run the risk of undermining the very values that can be helpful to us today.
Well, okay, just a quick follow-up. So, it's quite an optimistic view then that we can import at least substantial aspects of the Confucian tradition, and they will help us to solve or resolve certain problems we face. I mean, one sort of worry that I would have about that is, well, two perhaps. So one would be that the example of climate change is a bit tendentious because it's not really a problem that people face in their everyday decision making. It might be one that governments have to address in terms of policy. Well, I suppose there might be aspects of personal behavior that are involved, but it's not something that is always going to be in the forefront of one's decision making. But I suppose a wider worry would be that
Now, it may,
Yeah, what yeah. Just say, I mean that, say that the sexual norms would seem to be markedly out of step with certain modern habits, for instance. Yeah. I'll leave it there.
right. Now let me address your point about how climate change in general might not be so much of a concern to individuals on an everyday level. And yeah, if it isn't, that's a problem. I mean, the fact that we are not concerned with these issues on an everyday basis while making daily decisions we make, that is a problem. And that is a problem that could be solved with governing resources, educational resources. This is something whereby, yes, we could use some guidelines as to things that we ought to be more concerned with. How do we deal with waste, food waste that is leading to global warming, right? The trash waste that we're generating as a result of our lifestyles. So contrary to just going with the status quo where, yeah, folks are just callous about these issues, it's time. It's time for communities and nations to step up and say, wait a minute, think about what you're doing on a daily basis. Yeah, when it comes to the practices of casual sex, yeah, I can't imagine any of these philosophers recommending them simply because they're destructive of one's character, and not to mention community.
Right. So this would involve sort of a pretty radical reworking of modern liberal norms then. But you're saying that that would be good because we need to do that. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And so
I see.
I think that what these philosophers have to offer civic virtues, the cultivation, the education of civic virtues and responsibilities, which we are in desperate lack nowadays.
Right.
The fact that, folks would be uncivilized in the ways that they interact with each other. That's definitely something that could be changed and would be encouraged in these traditions. I think was there a question in the chat?
Yeah, Maggie has a question. Maggie, do you want to just ask it, please?
Yes, sure. So my question was, I wrote it down. Hold on here. How and in what aspect of life do you suggest it is appropriate that we begin implementing these Confucian ideas? Would it be appropriate, like where would we start in relation to recent issues like gun rights and school shootings?
All right. Yes. It's a problem for the United States to have the number of guns and the access to guns, right, that we do in this country. And I think that it's all bound up with the politics and how the far right are defending their rights to gun ownership. And if a Confucianism were to look at it, then what would the question, right, and the source of change be? I think the question would be, what's a gun for? Right? And this, I think, is an argument that is already made against gun ownership, and that is that it's for harming somebody else. It's for taking a life. And I'm sorry, if you need a semi-automatic weapon in order to go hunting, you must not be a very good hunter. And you might, want to go back to something more traditional, try a crossbow. And gosh, Confucius himself advocates fishing using a hook and line, and instead of using a net that would end up catching too many fish and sea creatures that you won't be consuming. So if that is the reason, for gun ownership, and how it then leads to the overproliferation of these weapons and then the abuse of them, yeah, that would be something that these virtue traditions would recommend changing. And at this point, unless you have some kind of, it's so polarized in the United States that it's difficult to envision the sort of programs that you see in, a place like New Zealand, which succeeded in collecting so many of the weapons out there, and also other practices of these European, nations, whereby they insist on more stringent measures for owning guns, where you need to pass a test. For instance, a very rigorous test before you have the right to bear arms. And that's not the case in this country. But it's because of the very liberal politics, I think, that it's hard to come by. And what the Confucians would propose is that it's going to take generations of modifications of behaviors and education and civic virtues, and before anything like that can change. Does that answer your question? So there is no overnight solution to this crisis. And it's the sort of crisis that one would have to gradually solve by chipping away the sources of problems.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Are there other questions before I ask another one? Cecilia, Joe?
Well, perhaps one. Coming back to the question about climate change, I was thinking that one really prominent aspect of life in contemporary societies is the worry of young people about their future, because of climate change, and they're calling out the generation of their parents and grandparents for actually causing the current state. And there certainly is a fair amount of resentment, often in the way they express themselves. And you mentioned so the perhaps the benefits of being able to express oneself without resentment while disagreeing with the older generation. Would you like to say something about that?
Yes. So there is most people who read the Confucians attribute to them this view that they're very conservative and you're supposed to respect the elders, so that you shouldn't be talking in a way that is disapproving of them or to disagree with their views. And in that particular analect, Confucius actually talks about remonstrating with one's parents, so that it is actually our responsibility to let them know that what they're engaging in, the actions that they're engaging in are incorrect. So it's not a matter of just being silent and letting them continue with their errors, but rather, it's our responsibility to inform them that, well, these are the consequences of what you do, and you should consider stopping. And here you see, when it comes to Confucius, notice that what he goes on to say is that if they do not heed your recommendations or your suggestions, do not act contrary. But the recommendation is that it's the attitude that you should adopt while dealing with them, so that it's one of perseverance. So if you don't succeed the first time, all right, take a break and then try again to persuade them. And who knows, over time, he thinks that you'll have success in dealing with your elders, and they're not unreasonable. If you think about these Confucian values, if all of us are supposed to pursue the perfection of being humane or benevolent toward others, that is a value then that cuts across the generations, so that even the parents have to be shamed by not being benevolent, and they would be all that more ashamed, especially if their faults were alerted to them, if they were alerted to their faults by their children. Right? So I think that they're right about our relationships, our familial relationships, and how important they are in forming our characters. And there is this relationship whereby we are supposed to be the moral exemplars for our children, but if we're not, we then would be moved by shame to change our ways. So perhaps a single conversation might not do it, but over time, that should have some impact. And it may take years. It may take years. But the thing about this culture is that, you know, that there are these feelings of compassion and relationships that foster the moral beings we are to become. And those are the resources, if you will, to, right, changing and dealing with crisis that we face.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we are at 2:30, and we are happy to have May talk to us for this amount of time. Thank you for your excellent discussion, May, and for your paper. I really did enjoy that. So let's give May another round of applause. And we will return in the spring with 2 more talks. I have dates that I'll send out later, but I want to get the titles first. So we'll get those together and send those out. Thank you, everyone, for coming today, and have a happy holidays. Goodbye.
Thanks so much to everyone. I really appreciate your questions and you're spending your time with me on a Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.